the original story. Like, so when you're talking about the biblical translations of the Adam and Eve story that we're all accustomed to, AI work on this and try to break it down into pronouns, nouns, verbs, or whatever they're using.
What if the Garden of Eden story you've always heard was only half the truth? No snake, no apple, just radiant beings from a realm of light, manipulating humanity from the very beginning. And the texts that revealed this? Buried, banned. But now, AI has started to decode what was never meant to be read. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some scriptures were never allowed in your Bible, and it seems Joe Rogan might agree with that too. Forbidden texts, hidden from the Bible. There's a reason some books were never allowed to sit next to Genesis and Revelation, a reason why certain scriptures were locked in monasteries, buried in deserts, or passed down in secret, written in languages only a handful of people could read. And the Book of Adam and Eve, sometimes called the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, is one of those texts. Now, it didn't vanish because it was unimportant. Quite the opposite. First appearing in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, this mysterious manuscript was likely composed between the 3rd and 5th centuries AD. It survived through centuries of obscurity, copied by Christian monks, and eventually translated into Latin, Slavonic, and Arabic. Yet despite its clear connection to the Genesis story, it was left out of the canonized Bible. And that decision wasn't accidental. This book doesn't just retell the Garden of Eden story, it completely reframes it. Instead of ending with Adam and Eve's banishment, this text picks up after the fall, describing in elaborate, almost mystical detail the couple's trials, torments, and their direct confrontations with strange, supernatural entities. It's not just theology, it's myth, horror, cosmic drama, and maybe, just maybe, something deeper. What makes this so compelling is how different cultures preserved different versions. For instance, while the Western world largely ignored it, Ethiopian Christians treated this book as spiritual truth. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church even kept it among their sacred texts for generations, suggesting it carried a deeper, more accepted meaning within African Christianity than in Europe.
It's said to be guarded by priests of the Ethiopian Church.
So why did other churches abandon it? When the church began standardizing scripture during major gatherings like the Council of Carthage in 397 AD, they decided what was divinely inspired and what wasn't. Any text that featured ambiguous theology, contradictory timelines, or too much mysticism was left out. That included writings that portrayed Satan not just as a tempter, but as an active cosmic enemy involved in ongoing battles with Adam. The Book of Adam and Eve didn't fit the polished story the church wanted to tell. It was too raw, too strange, too speculative. Some scholars say it bordered on heresy. Others think it revealed truths the church wasn't ready to deal with. And here's a curious fact. Versions of this story have been discovered in ancient monastic libraries across the Middle East, Armenia, and even in Slavic manuscripts in Eastern Europe. In each, small tweaks reflect local beliefs, but the core mystery remains intact. These weren't fringe texts. They were preserved, copied, and shared, just not with the general public. What's even more fascinating, some of the language in the Book of Adam and Eve, like references to the light from the realm above and the watchers from the sky, mirror terminology used in other forbidden texts, like the Book of Enoch or even certain Dead Sea Scroll fragments. That suggests a cross-pollination of ideas between early apocalyptic and mystical Jewish Christian writers. And then, there's the kicker. These texts don't describe Adam and Eve as passive figures. They portray them as aware, distressed, even rebellious at times. They cry out to God, they fast, they build altars, they fight back against evil. This narrative isn't about simple punishment, it's about survival in a corrupted world. In one chilling passage, Adam is led by Satan to a mountaintop and thrown down a cliff. In another, Eve is tricked by an angel of darkness disguised in radiant light. These aren't stories for children. They're cosmic, terrifying, and deeply symbolic. And perhaps that's why the book was hidden. not because it lacked value, but because it contained too much. No snake, no apple, just beings from the bright realm. Forget everything you thought you knew about the Garden of Eden, because in the book of Adam and Eve, the infamous talking snake doesn't even exist, not in the way most people imagine. In these forgotten texts, the role of the tempter is something far stranger, celestial beings from a so-called bright realm. Some even call them the Shining Ones. One of the most eerie differences in this version is how temptation plays out. In place of a sly serpent coiled around a tree, we get radiant figures, beautiful, glowing, and authoritative. In several chapters, these beings appear to Adam and Eve in the form of angels, but they're not angels of comfort. They lie, they trick, they deceive. In one scene, a being of light tells Adam that God has abandoned him, that heaven has no place for a failed creation. The language used isn't evil in tone, it's loving, persuasive, almost divine. But the intentions are clearly sinister. These aren't your Sunday school angels. They're manipulative, mysterious, and maybe even alien in nature. The term bright realm comes up repeatedly in different translations. In Ethiopian versions, it's described as a place of pure light, far above earth, where beings of power reside.
How do you perceive that force? Is it just energy, or do you anthropomorphize it?
Not all of whom answer to God. Some scholars believe this reference aligns eerily with descriptions in other ancient texts, like the Book of Enoch's Watchers, or even Mesopotamian myths involving gods who descended from the heavens to interact with mankind. Could this be an early literary hint at something more, something otherworldly? One particularly bizarre theory floated by fringe researchers. The beings from the bright realm weren't symbolic at all. They were literal extraterrestrials. According to this view, the Book of Adam and Eve is less about sin and more about humanity's first contact. That's why there's no snake, just entities interfering with Earth's first couple in ways they didn't fully understand. Even if you dismiss that theory, the imagery is striking. In multiple scenes, Adam and Eve are said to be overwhelmed by blinding light, sudden changes in atmosphere, and odd sensations when these beings appear.
So we know both those things are real things. We just don't know what's the root of them all. And are there really angels and demons?
It's not unlike the kind of descriptions found in ancient UFO accounts or religious visions across cultures. And what's most intriguing is the tone. These bright beings never explicitly state they are evil. They claim to offer knowledge, power, freedom. Sound familiar? That's because it mirrors the same pitch used by the serpent in Genesis. But here, it's wrapped in robes of light instead of scales and hissing. In another version of the tale, Satan himself takes on the form of a radiant angel and mocks Adam for his fall, laughing at him from a cloud above. This act of shape-shifting and appearing as light is something even the New Testament later references. Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. That's from 2 Corinthians 11:14. That verse makes more sense when you've read this book. And the idea that Eden's story wasn't just about disobedience, but a deeper cosmic test involving unknown powers changes everything. Was Earth always a battleground? Were Adam and Eve the first test subjects? Or worse, were they never meant to succeed? It's these kinds of details, these deeply unsettling reinterpretations, that make the Book of Adam and Eve one of the most controversial ancient texts ever uncovered. AI tools just helped decode lost portions. For centuries, the full story in the Book of Adam and Eve remained fractured, buried in damaged scrolls, faded translations, or scattered across obscure religious libraries in Ethiopia, Armenia, and Eastern Europe. Even the copies that survived were often incomplete, riddled with missing lines, corrupted syntax, and centuries of scribal errors. Scholars tried for decades to piece together the puzzle, but they were always missing something. Then I stepped in. Over the past few years, a quiet revolution has been happening in the world of ancient texts. Teams from institutions like Oxford University, in collaboration with Google's DeepMind, have been using machine learning to help decode, restore, and contextualize long-lost historical documents.
The artificial intelligence that powers Ithaca is based on cutting-edge technology developed here at Google's DeepMind.
One of their most groundbreaking tools is called Ithaca, an AI trained to read damaged or fragmentary ancient scripts and suggest accurate restorations, even identifying their possible locations and dates of origin. Originally tested on Greek inscriptions, Ithaca stunned scholars when it began predicting missing words and context with up to 72% accuracy, far beyond anything ever achieved manually.
Ithaca's networks replicate some of the work done by historians, analysing what an inscription says to fill in missing words.
But it didn't stop there. Scholars began training similar models on lesser-known languages like Ge'ez, Syriac, and Coptic, the very scripts in which the Book of Adam and Eve and related apocryphal texts were preserved. As a result, AI began to breathe life back into texts long considered broken beyond repair. One notable breakthrough came in 2022, when a group of researchers used AI to reassemble portions of the life of Adam and Eve from different versions across Latin and Slavic manuscripts. Previously, these manuscripts didn't seem to match up, but the AI was able to detect linguistic patterns and common narrative structures that suggested they were actually telling the same story in different ways. By aligning those variants, scholars could finally reconstruct passages that had been missing for nearly 1,600 years. Even more impressive, AI wasn't just decoding letters, it was catching themes. In some cases, it noticed theological shifts and inconsistencies that pointed to later alterations by church scribes. For instance, in certain versions, Eve is portrayed with more agency, questioning divine commands, bargaining with spiritual beings. Earlier scholars thought these lines were corruptions, but the AI found that this portrayal was consistent in older layers of the text, suggesting it might have been edited out by later religious authorities. Another AI-assisted discovery involved the so-called satanic deception sequences. Previously thought to be different events, the AI recognized a structure across 3 manuscripts where Satan takes on radiant, godlike forms to mislead Adam, not once, but repeatedly over time. This confirmed theories that the book wasn't a one-time event story, but a cycle of manipulation. Some researchers even used AI to map out the sequence of supernatural appearances in the Book of Adam and Eve, comparing it to ancient Sumerian myths and Enochian writings. What emerged was a strange web of similarities.
When the text of an inscription is entered, Ithaca provides options for any missing words, along with probabilities for each guess.
Beings descending in light, offering forbidden wisdom, only to twist reality around the humans who accept it. And here's the kicker. AI helped detect entire missing chapters. Based on thematic gaps and abrupt narrative shifts, models predicted that certain key sections, perhaps dealing with the origin of these bright realm beings or the mechanics of Eden's spiritual geography, had been lost or suppressed. In 2023, archaeologists unearthed a manuscript fragment in northern Ethiopia that appeared to match one of these predicted gaps, a moment where Adam speaks of hearing multiple voices in the garden, some commanding obedience, others offering truth. This revelation has lit a fire under biblical scholars, because now AI isn't just helping us recover history, it's forcing us to question who got to shape that history in the first place. The message isn't about sin. It's about surveillance. The traditional story of Adam and Eve has always centered on a single idea: sin. They broke the rule, ate the fruit, and paradise was lost. Simple. But the Book of Adam and Eve, especially in its restored versions, tells a far more disturbing tale. It's not about a single mistake. It's about constant observation, psychological warfare, and manipulation from above and beyond. In this version, Adam and Eve aren't just cast out of Eden, they're watched. Not metaphorically, literally. They speak of eyes in the sky, of voices that echo through the wilderness. They hide not from shame, but from presence. Some scholars interpret these details as metaphors for guilt, but others see something else: surveillance. In the Latin Vita Adae et Evae, Eve describes being shown terrifying visions of her descendants suffering, dying, and being enslaved. But the visions don't come from God. They come from the one who deceives in light. In other words, her tormentor isn't a shadowy serpent. It's a spectator dressed in purity. Someone, or something, is pulling strings and forcing her to watch. These scenes have led to wild theories. some even suggesting that the garden was less a paradise and more an experiment, that Adam and Eve weren't banished out of anger, but because the test was over. They had been pushed, watched, manipulated, and finally expelled. Further fueling this idea is the recurring phrase in some Ge'ez manuscripts, "He who monitors the dust." Adam is made from dust, and the being who tempts him refers to watching his form from before he was animated. That implies foreknowledge, planning, and design. In these texts, Satan doesn't just show up post-fall, he's already there, lurking, planning. And the bright beings aren't reacting to rebellion, they're initiating it. Over and over again, Adam and Eve are offered truth, freedom, sight, but only if they abandon their creator. This isn't temptation, it's a psychological operation, a stress test of loyalty under invisible pressure. Even more disturbing is how pain is used. Adam and Eve are subjected to long fasting, starvation, hallucinations, and even self-harm, rituals that echo ancient initiation ceremonies. But they're not initiated by God, they're just hoping he's still watching, because by this point, they're not sure who's observing or why. The life of Adam and Eve also contains a controversial passage where Adam speaks to his son Seth and warns him that Earth is not what it seems. He claims that there are those who rule the winds and observe the waters, and that you must not speak aloud where the watchers roam. Some interpret this as early animism, but others believe it reflects a form of ancient spiritual paranoia, a belief that even your thoughts were being monitored. And that brings us to perhaps the most chilling idea, the notion that humanity's fall wasn't a crime, but a provocation, that Eden wasn't paradise, but a controlled environment designed to observe behavior under pressure. Some theorists have even linked this to Gnostic ideas that the Creator was not truly benevolent, but a demiurge, a lower power enforcing limitations on spiritual beings like Adam and Eve. Under this reading, the snake didn't cause the fall, he triggered the awakening. These interpretations might sound fringe, but they're grounded in actual textual analysis. Scholars like Andrei Orlov and Michael Stone have written extensively about the surveillance themes in apocryphal literature, and with AI restoring more and more lost content, the themes only get clearer. Maybe that's the real reason the Book of Adam and Eve was hidden, not because it contradicted the Bible, but because it decoded it. Why was it left out of the Bible? The question has haunted scholars for generations. If the Book of Adam and Eve was so widely preserved, copied in multiple languages, and even referenced in other early Christian writings, why wasn't it included in the Bible? The answer lies in a mix of politics, theology, fear, and something deeper that most never dare to touch, the need for control. To understand this, we have to go back to the chaotic early centuries of Christianity. Back then, there was no single Bible.
Early Christianity was not a monolithic movement with a tidy, agreed-upon set of sacred books and beliefs. Far from it.
Different communities had their own collections of sacred texts, some overlapping, many wildly different. In Alexandria, scrolls circulated that painted God as a remote architect. In Jerusalem, texts emphasized divine justice. And in the deserts of Egypt and Ethiopia, strange books like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of Adam and Eve were read with equal reverence. It wasn't until the late 4th century that the Church decided it needed one unified narrative. That meant choosing which books to keep and which to bury. The Council of Carthage in 397 AD is often pointed to as the moment where the modern biblical canon began to solidify in the West. Church leaders debated which texts aligned with doctrine, which ones were too confusing, and which ones were outright dangerous. The Book of Adam and Eve didn't stand a chance. Why? First, its message was too weird. It didn't follow the clean, linear arc the Church wanted to teach: creation, fall, punishment, redemption. Instead, it spiraled into surreal scenes, cosmic beings, psychological torment, and spiritual ambiguity. Adam and Eve weren't just sinners, they were victims of something far bigger and more confusing than a snake and a tree. Second, the book leaned into themes that echoed Gnostic theology, a belief system the early church worked hard to stamp out. Gnostics taught that the material world was a prison and that salvation came through secret knowledge, gnosis, rather than obedience. The Book of Adam and Eve doesn't go full Gnostic, but it shares striking similarities: celestial manipulators, hidden knowledge, and the idea that Adam and Eve's suffering had a greater, possibly redemptive, purpose. Even more threatening, the book presents a non-linear view of time. Adam sees visions of future generations. He experiences time loops. Some versions suggest that events in Eden were predestined, an echo of deterministic beliefs that challenged the Church's doctrine of free will and moral responsibility. If the fall was inevitable, how could humanity be blamed? But perhaps the biggest problem was this: the book raised questions without offering clean answers. It asked, who are these shining beings? Why are they testing Adam? Why does God seem so distant after the fall? Why is there so much pain in the world if all they did was make a choice? These are dangerous questions for an institution trying to teach faith through clarity, not confusion. The early church needed order. This book delivered mystery, and mystery is harder to control. There's also another layer, one rarely discussed in textbooks. The book of Adam and Eve conflicted with the developing image of Satan. In canonical texts, Satan is largely absent until the New Testament, where he appears more clearly as a tempter and enemy of Christ. But in the book of Adam and Eve, Satan is front and center from the beginning, waging a personal war against Adam out of jealousy for being replaced. This early characterization didn't match the theological evolution the Church had planned, including it would have forced a rethink of Satan's origins, and that was a door they weren't willing to open. Interestingly, some Eastern Christian traditions never fully rejected the text. In Ethiopian Christianity, the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan continued to be copied and recited alongside the Psalms and Gospel. Their canon has always been larger and more inclusive than that of Western Christianity. For them, these stories weren't heresy, they were heritage. Another reason for exclusion may have been simple logistics, the sheer number of versions. Unlike the Gospels, which were eventually harmonized into 4 accepted accounts.
This standardized canon included the now familiar Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
The Book of Adam and Eve existed in multiple wildly different manuscripts, with additions, removals, and cultural edits. The Latin version, the Slavonic version, the Ethiopic version, they all told slightly different stories. The Church didn't want to sift through all of that. They wanted certainty, consensus, standardization. And here's a striking modern parallel. Just like the early church filtered out texts to craft an official narrative, today's information ecosystems do the same. We curate what people see. We suppress what doesn't fit. What gets algorithmically hidden or amplified isn't based solely on truth. It's based on cohesion, simplicity, and control. The Book of Adam and Eve was a victim of the same filter. Fascinating, but inconvenient. Today, that's exactly why it's being studied again. AI, academic freedom, and global access to digital libraries have allowed researchers to revisit forgotten texts with fresh eyes. What was once dismissed as myth is now recognized as a valuable artifact of early human imagination and theology. A spiritual fossil, preserving not just a story, but a mindset, a fear, a hope, a question. Was Eden a paradise or a trap? Was the fall a failure or the beginning of awakening? And most importantly, if we were being watched then, are we still being watched now? The Book of Adam and Eve doesn't answer these questions. It doesn't try to. Instead, it whispers, it hints, it dares you to look past the clean pages of the modern Bible and ask, what else was left out? And more disturbingly, why? And if forbidden texts like this exist, how many more are still hidden? Drop your thoughts below, because this story is far from over. What if the truth was edited out, on purpose?